The rich boy mocked the humble young woman, certain she would never even touch Shadow. But what the horse did next left the crowd holding its breath. Riley Jenkins awoke at 4:30 a.m., long before the first hint of dawn touched the rolling hills of Lexington, Kentucky. Her small attic room was frigid. The ancient heating system never quite reached the converted space she called home. Pulling her threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders, she allowed herself 5 more minutes of warmth before facing another day of being invisible. The worn copy of Black Beauty rested on her nightstand, its spine cracked from countless readings. Riley reached for it, fingers tracing the faded illustration on the cover. It was her only inheritance, the last tangible connection to her mother, who had read it to her every night before the accident 12 years ago. "The horses know who you really are," her mother used to whisper. "They see beyond appearances." At 17, Riley had spent more time with horses than people. 8 foster homes in 12 years had taught her that humans were unpredictable. But horses were honest. They didn't care that her clothes came from thrift stores or that her school uniform had been patched 3 times. They didn't whisper, "the girl without a real last name," when she walked past. Downstairs, the house remained silent. The Millers, foster family number 8, wouldn't wake for hours. They were adequate caretakers who provided shelter and collected their monthly check from the state, asking little of Riley beyond basic chores and staying out of trouble. Not the worst placement she'd had, but not a home either. Riley dressed quickly in the dark, jeans worn thin at the knees, a flannel shirt too big for her frame, and the work boots she'd found at a garage sale last summer. Her chestnut hair went into a practical ponytail, no makeup to bother with. In a region where appearance meant everything, Riley had learned to be invisible by necessity. The kitchen was dark as she grabbed an apple and a granola bar, scribbling a note to remind the Millers she'd be home late. Outside, the pre-dawn air bit at her cheeks as she wheeled her rust-spotted bicycle from beside the porch. The ancient 10-speed had been abandoned behind a dumpster, repaired with parts scavenged from the junkyard. Like Riley herself, it was cobbled together, functional but unwanted. The streets of Lexington's outskirts were empty as she pedaled through neighborhoods that gradually transformed from modest homes to sprawling estates. 10 miles lay between the Millers' 2-bedroom house and the Henderson estate, where Riley mucked stalls 3 mornings a week. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, she cleaned at the Wilkins property instead. Weekends meant double shifts at both, plus any other odd jobs she could find. Her breath formed clouds in the cold March air as the Henderson estate came into view, wrought iron gates guarding a long tree-lined driveway that led to a colonial mansion gleaming white even in the pre-dawn darkness. Riley didn't approach the main entrance. The service road around back led directly to the stables, where horses worth more than most houses waited for the girl no one noticed. "Morning, Jorge," she called softly to the elderly stable manager who was already distributing feed. "Morning, Chica," he replied, his weathered face crinkling into a smile. "Mr. Henderson has guests this weekend. They want to ride at 9, so everything needs to shine." Riley nodded, already reaching for the wheelbarrow and pitchfork. The routine never varied. Clean stalls, replace bedding, scrub water troughs, sweep aisles. Invisible work for invisible people. Jorge was the first person to notice Riley's gift. 2 years ago, when she'd started at the Hendersons, a valuable mare had been colicking. While the veterinarian and trainers argued about treatment, 14-year-old Riley had quietly observed the mare's breathing pattern, the specific angle of her ears, the almost imperceptible tension in her left hind leg. "She's not colicking," Riley had whispered to Jorge. "She's got pain in her left hip. See how she shifts her weight?" Jorge had convinced the vet to check, revealing a deep muscle bruise that mimicked colic symptoms. Since then, he'd quietly sought Riley's observations whenever a horse showed distress. As dawn broke over the Kentucky bluegrass, Riley finished the last stall and moved to the training paddock. Here, she could watch the horses without being observed herself. Mr. Peterson, the Hendersons' trainer, talked constantly about dominance and control. Riley saw something different, horses communicating through subtle ear flicks, tail swishes, and weight shifts that told entire stories to those willing to listen. "You've got arthritis starting in your right knee, don't you, Monarch?" she murmured to the aging thoroughbred watching her from his paddock. The gelding's ears pricked forward at the sound of her voice. "They don't notice you favoring it yet, but I do." Her phone buzzed, a rare occurrence that startled her. The screen showed a message from Lucia, a Mexican girl who worked in the kitchen at Fairfield Ranch, the most prestigious property in the area. "Need help today. 2 staff fired yesterday. Extra $50 if you can come after Henderson's. Rich people breakfast mess." Riley texted back immediately. $50 meant new shoes for school, or perhaps setting aside something toward community college applications. She couldn't afford to pass it up. 4 hours later, Riley pedaled through the imposing entrance of Fairfield Ranch, a property that made the Hendersons' estate look modest by comparison. Owned by William Montgomery, a Texas oil magnate who'd moved to Kentucky 5 years ago, Fairfield wasn't just a farm. It was a statement of wealth. The main house rose like a Greek temple on the horizon, columns gleaming in the late morning sun. The stables were constructed of imported hardwood and custom ironwork, more luxurious than any house Riley had ever lived in. Lucia waited by the service entrance, her kitchen uniform immaculate despite the morning's work. "Thanks for coming," she said, leading Riley through a maze of corridors to the industrial kitchen. The young master had friends for breakfast. 12 people, everything from omelets to Belgian waffles. The mess is incredible. As Riley helped clear delicate china plates with barely touched food, she glanced through the massive windows overlooking the training rings. A group of young men and women in expensive riding attire circled the main arena, laughing and showing off. At the center was Blake Montgomery, the owner's 19-year-old son, guiding his chestnut stallion through a series of impressive jumps. "3-time junior national champion," Lucia commented, following Riley's gaze. "And he never lets anyone forget it." Blake dismounted with practiced grace, immediately surrounded by admirers. His golden hair caught the sunlight, his smile confident as he accepted praise. Everything about him radiated the casual assurance of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. "Come," Lucia whispered after they'd finished cleaning. "I want to show you something before you go." They slipped out through the garden, avoiding the main paths where staff might question their presence. Lucia led Riley toward a secluded corner of the property, where a separate stable stood apart from the main complex. Unlike the showcase stables near the house, this building had reinforced walls and higher fences surrounding it. "That's where they keep Shadow," Lucia explained in a hushed tone. "Nobody can get near him." Riley had heard whispers about Shadow, a 3-year-old black thoroughbred valued at over $500,000. The horse had survived a terrible fire that killed his previous owner and 3 other horses in a neighboring county. Montgomery had purchased him at an exorbitant price, attracted by his impressive bloodline and breeding potential, ignoring warnings about the animal's behavior after the trauma. "He's attacked 3 handlers already," Lucia continued as they cautiously approached the fence line. "The last one needed 18 stitches in his arm. Mr. Montgomery has brought in 6 different horse whisperers. None of them made any progress." As they neared the outer fence, Riley caught her first glimpse of Shadow. Inside an isolated paddock, he was pure majesty and fury combined. His black coat gleamed in the sunlight, contrasting with a large whitish scar running down his right flank, a permanent reminder of the fire that nearly killed him. He paced in agitated circles, muscles tense like coiled springs, eyes vigilant and distrustful. "He won't let anyone put a saddle on him. Goes crazy when they try," Lucia explained. "The young master tried to ride him 3 times. The last time, Shadow nearly killed him." Riley remained motionless, observing. There was something familiar in those eyes, a reflection of her own distrust of the world. On impulse, she walked to the fence, ignoring Lucia's urgent warning to stay back. Then it happened. Shadow, who moments before had been threatening any handlers who passed at a distance, stopped his nervous circuit. His ears, previously flattened against his head in aggression, moved forward toward Riley. For one fleeting moment, horse and girl looked at each other. "Él reconoce algo en ti," Lucia murmured, wide-eyed. The imposing animal, whose reputation terrified even the most experienced riders in the region, slowly approached the fence where Riley stood. There was no threat in his movements now, only cautious curiosity. A few yards away, Shadow stopped, assessing the girl with eyes that seemed to contain all the suffering in the world. Then, in a gesture that made Lucia gasp, the horse slightly lowered his majestic head, as if in a subtle bow. "What the hell is going on here?" The voice cut through the moment like a knife. Blake Montgomery, followed by two richly dressed friends, approached with furious steps. Shadow immediately retreated, ears flattened again, body tensed. "You shouldn't be here," Blake snapped at Riley. "This horse is dangerous." "Sorry, sir," Lucia intervened quickly. "We were just leaving." As Lucia pulled her away, Riley looked back one last time. Shadow remained in the same spot, his eyes fixed on her, as if something invisible and profound had been established between them, a mutual recognition of souls that knew the pain of abandonment and loss. "I've never seen him do that," whispered one of the Mexican handlers who had been observing the scene from a distance. "Never with anyone." That night, lying in her small attic room at the foster home, Riley couldn't get Shadow out of her thoughts. The connection had been instantaneous and profound, like looking in a mirror and seeing not just your reflection, but your soul. Both of them outsiders, both carrying invisible scars, both judged by appearances rather than essence. As moonlight filtered through her window, Riley gently stroked the worn cover of Black Beauty and made a decision that would change her life forever. Tomorrow, she would return to that isolated stable, no matter the risk. For the first time in years, she had found a being who truly saw her, not as the invisible stable girl, but as someone worthy of trust. The next morning, Riley arrived at Fairfield Ranch an hour before her usual cleaning shifts would begin. The estate slumbered under the fading stars, with only a few early-rising handlers starting their daily routines. Dew clung to the bluegrass, dampening her worn boots as she moved cautiously across the immaculate lawns. She kept to the shadows of ornamental hedges, avoiding the security cameras that Manuel, one of Lucia's cousins who worked security, had pointed out to her the previous day. "Stay close to the boxwoods along the south path," he had explained in hushed tones after Lucia introduced them. "The cameras sweep the main areas, but there's a 10-second gap in coverage if you time it right." The isolated stable where Shadow was kept stood silent against the lightening sky. Riley didn't attempt to enter. Instinct told her that would shatter any nascent trust. Instead, she settled herself at a respectful distance, pulled the battered copy of Black Beauty from her backpack, and began to read in a low, gentle voice. "My first home was in a large, pleasant meadow with a pond of clear water in it." At the sound of her voice, Shadow stirred inside his enclosure. His massive form appeared at the half door of his stall, ears pricked forward, then immediately flattened as he pawed the ground nervously. Riley continued reading, her voice steady, making no sudden movements. Gradually, the horse's agitated movements slowed, though he remained watchful, his dark eyes fixed on her with wary intensity. For 5 consecutive mornings, Riley maintained the ritual. She arrived at the same time, sat in the same spot, and read for 30 minutes before departing for her regular duties. By the third day, the stable hands had noticed her presence but, curiously, made no move to stop her. Some watched from a distance, expressions ranging from amusement to curiosity. "La chica loca," one of them muttered, though not unkindly. "The crazy girl thinks the devil horse understands her stories." On the 6th day, Riley arrived to find Shadow already waiting near the fence, his posture still cautious, but visibly less tense. His ears flickered forward at her approach, though he maintained a safe distance. "You like stories about free horses, don't you?" Riley murmured when she noticed how attentive Shadow seemed during particular passages. "My mother said this book was about freedom and respect. She left too soon, just like your owner." 2 weeks into her visits, Shadow's demeanor had changed enough that even the skeptical handlers noticed. Riley discovered through careful conversations with the workers, particularly with elderly Mr. Martinez, who had worked on the property for over 20 years, that Shadow's former owner had been a creature of habit who always played country music while tending his horses. The next morning, Riley brought a small battery-powered radio and, positioning it at a safe distance, tuned it to a station playing classic country. The reaction was immediate. Shadow, who had been particularly agitated that day, visibly calmed at the sound of Dolly Parton's Jolene filling the morning air. "Old people music," commented one of the younger handlers dismissively. "But he remembers," Riley replied softly. "His memory is tied to it." Gradually, Riley began bringing an apple in her pocket. She never offered it directly, simply left it in the same spot on the fence before walking away. For the first few days, Shadow didn't approach. On the fourth day, when she had already left for her cleaning duties, Mr. Martinez witnessed the horse cautiously approach and take the fruit. "The devil horse ate your gift," he told Riley later, clearly impressed. He has never accepted food from anyone since he arrived. During her third week of visits, Riley was startled by the appearance of William Montgomery himself. The businessman, immaculate in his tailored suit and perfectly styled gray hair, approached while she was reading to Shadow. "So, you're the girl who's been visiting my $500,000 investment," he said without preamble. Riley stood quickly, clutching the book to her chest. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't enter the stable, I just—" Montgomery interrupted her with a gesture. "The staff talk about you. They say the horse responds differently to your presence." He observed Shadow, who maintained his distance but wasn't showing his usual aggression. "I brought in a horse whisperer from California last week. He charged $10,000 to tell me the animal might never recover from the trauma." His eyes assessed Riley from head to toe. The simple clothes, the worn boots, the brown hair tied in a practical ponytail. "What's your name, girl?" "Riley Jenkins, sir." "Jenkins." He considered the name. "You work for the Hendersons, don't you? Cleaning stables?" "Yes, sir. And at the Wilkins property on Tuesdays and Thursdays." Montgomery looked again at Shadow, then at the book in Riley's hands. An idea seemed to form in his mind. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Jenkins." That afternoon, whispers spread throughout Fairfield Ranch and neighboring properties like wildfire. During a lunch with several influential breeders from the region, William Montgomery had made a public challenge. "If you can get my son to ride Shadow, the horse will be yours." The declaration prompted laughter among the guests. Blake Montgomery, visibly irritated by the situation, immediately protested. "Father, this is ridiculous. This girl isn't even a trainer. She cleans stables." "Exactly," Montgomery replied with a calculating smile. "If she fails, we'll have a bit of entertainment. If, by some miracle, she succeeds, we'll be rid of a problematic animal that's consuming resources and damaging our reputation." For Blake and his friends, the situation became a joke. "The stable girl and the killer horse," they mocked whenever Riley passed by. But for the farm workers, the Mexican handlers, the African-American gardeners, the Latina cooks, something important was happening. They began to observe the morning interactions from a distance, amazed by the girl's infinite patience. Riley, meanwhile, ignored both the mockery and the expectations. Her method remained the same. No hurry, no force. Now, with official permission, she began leaving a blanket with her scent in Shadow's stall overnight, a technique she'd learned reading a book about rehabilitating wild horses at the public library. Each step was meticulously planned. Riley kept a detailed journal about Shadow's behavior, which sounds frightened him, which calmed him, how weather affected his mood, which memories seemed to trigger panic reactions. "The fire came from the right," she murmured one morning, noticing how Shadow always became more agitated when someone approached from that side. "The scar, the trauma. You're still reliving that moment, aren't you?" During these one-sided conversations, Riley often shared her own traumas. Her mother's death, the years of loneliness in the foster system, the constant feeling of belonging nowhere. "We're alike," she said softly. "Nobody bet on us. They don't understand that sometimes we just need time and space to trust again." After a month, Riley achieved her first major breakthrough. With Shadow accustomed to her voice and presence, she finally entered the paddock, remaining motionless in the farthest corner, simply reading as she always did. The horse, initially tense, gradually returned to his routine, accepting her presence in his territory. 3 days later, she brought a soft brush and left it on the ground between them. The next day, she moved a few steps closer. Each movement was calculated to respect Shadow's space and time. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted. William Montgomery, who had initially seen the situation as entertainment, began to grow impatient. "We're almost at the end of the 2-month deadline, Miss Jenkins," he commented during one of his inspections. "So far, I see a girl reading to a horse, not an animal ready to be ridden." Blake and his friends intensified their harassment, appearing during the morning sessions to deliberately shout and frighten Shadow. "If he's so tame now, why don't you ride him already?" they taunted. It was Lucia who alerted Riley to their more sinister plans. "I heard Blake say he's bringing fireworks tomorrow to prove the horse is still dangerous," she whispered, as they cleaned the main kitchen together. That night, Riley couldn't sleep. The connection she had established with Shadow was too fragile to withstand such trauma. In the early morning hours, she cycled to Fairfield Ranch and, with Mr. Martinez's help, transferred Shadow to a more distant paddock, used only for pregnant mares. When Blake and his friends arrived the next morning with fireworks, they found only an empty stable and a note pinned to the door. "The animal's welfare comes before any challenge." Riley's action infuriated Blake, but impressed William Montgomery. "The girl has spine," he commented to his foreman. "And more importantly, she's thinking about the investment's value." The fireworks incident created an unexpected division on the property. While the Montgomery family and their closest associates saw Riley as an insolent intruder, the workers initiated an informal protection system. Someone always, coincidentally, was nearby when she worked with Shadow, ensuring she wouldn't be disturbed. At the beginning of the 6th week, it happened, the moment no one believed possible. Riley was sitting in the paddock, reading as always, when Shadow voluntarily approached and lay down on the ground a few feet from her. It was an extraordinary gesture of trust for such a traumatized animal. Lying down is a moment of extreme vulnerability for a horse. He lay down near her. One of the handlers murmured in Spanish to another, "Dios mío, I've never seen anything like it." The next day, Riley took an even greater risk. With slow, deliberate movements, she extended her hand toward the scar on Shadow's flank. The horse trembled slightly but didn't retreat. Her fingers gently touched the mark left by the fire, caressing the irregular hair that had grown over the damaged skin. "You survived," she whispered. "Your scars show your strength, not your weakness." The scene was witnessed by Mr. Martinez, who could hardly believe what he was seeing. Within minutes, the news spread throughout the property. The stable girl had touched the untouchable Shadow. While the rich mocked and placed bets on her failure, a silent alliance formed among the invisible workers of Fairfield Ranch, gardeners, handlers, cooks, who saw in Riley and Shadow something the Montgomerys would never understand. That sometimes, it's the broken and discarded of this world who possess the truest strength. The morning after Riley touched Shadow's scar, she found a folded piece of paper tucked inside her backpack. Opening it, she discovered a message written in careful Spanish. "Te observamos. Queremos ayudar. We are watching you. We want to help." Riley glanced around the bustling stable area, wondering who had left the note. Several workers nodded subtly in her direction. Jorge from the feed room, Alma, who cleaned the tack, 2 groundskeepers whose names she didn't know. They had been invisible to the Montgomerys, just as she had been. Now, they were forming an alliance of the unseen. Manuel approached as she was filling a water bucket. "The cameras," he murmured without looking directly at her. "They have blind spots." He proceeded to explain, while appearing to give instructions about stable work, how the security system had gaps, particularly during the shift change at 5:15 each morning, and near the eastern paddocks where a tree blocked the view. "Why are you helping me?" Riley asked quietly. Manuel's weathered face creased into a brief smile. "Some people see animals as things to own. Others see them as beings to understand. We know which kind you are, Chica." That evening, Riley started a detailed journal in a composition notebook she'd purchased from the dollar store. On the first page, she carefully documented everything she had observed about Shadow. How his right ear twitched when anxious. How he pawed the ground 3 times before charging. How his breathing changed when frightened. She noted how he seemed most agitated between 11 and 1, when the sun cast shadows that flickered across his paddock, reminiscent perhaps of dancing flames. "Shadow's triggers," she wrote, underlining the phrase. Below it she listed sudden movements from right side, scarred side, flapping objects, men with deep voices, cigarette smoke, the color red. The next page, Shadow's comforts, Dolly Parton songs, pre-dawn quiet, soft voice reading, apple treats, consistent routines. Riley carried this notebook everywhere, adding observations throughout the day. She borrowed books on equine psychology from the public library, studying trauma responses in animals. When the librarian asked if she had a horse, Riley had smiled and answered, "Not exactly, we're just learning to trust each other." On a crisp Wednesday morning, Riley arrived to find a faded plaid blanket folded neatly beside Shadow's paddock. Mr. Martinez stood nearby pretending to check a water line. "For the scent," he explained quietly. "The Wild Horse book says they need to know your smell. Sleep with it tonight, then we put it in his stall." Riley nodded, touched by his investment in her methods. "Thank you. My grandmother trained horses in Sonora," he added. "She said horses carry the wounds of their past in their bodies, not just their minds. Your touch yesterday, on his scar, it was good medicine." That night, Riley slept with the blanket wrapped around her pillow. The next morning before dawn, Mr. Martinez helped her slip it into Shadow's stall while the night guard took his coffee break. When Shadow returned from his morning turnout, he approached the blanket cautiously, nostrils flaring as he took in Riley's scent. Instead of trampling it as he had done with previous objects in his space, he simply stood over it, occasionally lowering his head to sniff. "Progress," Riley whispered to herself. As April blossomed across Kentucky, bringing a riot of dogwood and redbud flowers to Fairfield Ranch, Riley's methodical approach continued. Each day's small victory was recorded in her growing journal. The first time Shadow accepted an apple directly from her hand. The moment he allowed her to stand beside him rather than across the paddock. The day he didn't flinch when she raised her arm above shoulder height. There were setbacks too. A thunderstorm sent him into panic, reopening a gate wound that had just healed. A red baseball cap worn by a visitor triggered such aggression that Riley had to start from square one the following day, simply sitting and reading without attempting closer contact. "The trauma response isn't linear," she explained to Lucia over lunch in the staff break room. "Some days are better than others." "Like people," Lucia nodded. "My brother, after Afghanistan, some days he can go to the mall, other days he can't leave his room when a car backfires." William Montgomery began making regular appearances during Riley's morning sessions, watching with calculating eyes as Shadow gradually allowed the girl closer access to his space. One morning, as Riley was brushing Shadow's neck, the first time he'd permitted sustained contact, Montgomery's impatience finally boiled over. "We're almost at the end of the 2-month deadline, Miss Jenkins," he announced, checking his gold Rolex. "So far, I see a girl reading to a horse, not an animal ready to be ridden." Riley continued the gentle brushing strokes, careful not to break the rhythm that was keeping Shadow calm despite Montgomery's intrusion. "Progress with trauma isn't about deadlines, Mr. Montgomery. It's about building a foundation of trust. Trust doesn't pay stable fees," he retorted. "I invested in a breeding stallion, not a therapy patient." Shadow's muscles tensed beneath Riley's hand, his ears flicking back at Montgomery's raised voice. Riley maintained her calm strokes, her voice dropping even softer. "The deadline isn't for another 3 weeks. You'll have your demonstration." As Montgomery strode away, Riley noticed how Shadow's entire body had shifted protectively toward her during the exchange, placing himself between her and the perceived threat. Something fundamental had changed in their relationship. They were now protecting each other. The following Monday, Blake Montgomery and 3 of his private school friends appeared during Riley's morning session. They leaned against the fence, their equestrian outfits immaculate despite the early hour. "If he's so tame now, why don't you ride him already?" Blake called out mockingly. "Or are you just stalling because you know you'll fail?" Shadow immediately tensed, his newfound calm evaporating at the unfamiliar voices. Riley kept her position, continuing to read softly from Black Beauty, as if they weren't there. "Maybe she can't actually ride," one of Blake's friends suggested loudly. "Stable cleaners usually just shovel the crap, not handle the merchandise." Riley felt a flush of anger but channeled it into the steady rhythm of her reading. Shadow picked up on her emotion, moving closer to her rather than retreating, another small but significant change in their bond. After several minutes of taunting without response, Blake grew frustrated. He picked up a small stone and tossed it toward the paddock, not at Shadow directly, but close enough to startle the horse. Shadow reared, eyes wild with sudden fear, but instead of charging the fence as he would have weeks earlier, he circled back to Riley's side, trembling but controlled. "You're teaching him to be as pathetic as you are," Blake sneered before leading his friends away. Riley exhaled slowly, her heart pounding. She reached up to touch Shadow's neck, feeling the tremors beneath his skin. "You did good," she whispered. "You chose control over fear. That's huge progress." That evening, as Riley helped Lucia clean the main kitchen, her friend pulled her into the walk-in pantry, checking first to ensure they were alone. "I heard Blake talking to his friends in the dining room," Lucia whispered urgently. "They're planning to bring fireworks tomorrow morning to prove Shadow is still dangerous." Blake told them how Shadow went crazy during the 4th of July celebration last year. They had to sedate him. Riley felt sick. Fireworks? That could undo everything. He could hurt himself trying to escape. "I know," Lucia nodded. "Blake said that's the point. To prove the horse is unfixable, so his father will stop this circus show with you." That night, sleep eluded Riley. The connection she had established with Shadow was too precious, too fragile to withstand such a deliberate trauma trigger. Around 3 in the morning, she made her decision. The moon provided just enough light as Riley pedaled the 10 miles to Fairfield Ranch, arriving well before dawn. Mr. Martinez was waiting by the service entrance, his weathered face grim with determination. "We move him to the mare paddock behind the East training ring," he said without preamble. "Nobody uses it now. The pregnant mares were moved to the North Field last week." Together they worked quickly. Shadow was initially confused by the pre-dawn disruption to his routine, but Riley's soft voice and gentle hands kept him calm enough to lead across the property. The mare paddock was smaller but more sheltered, hidden from the main facilities by a stand of mature oak trees. After settling Shadow with fresh water and hay, Riley pinned a note to his empty stable door. "The animal's welfare comes before any challenge." They had barely finished when the first lights came on in the main house. Riley slipped away through the blind spot in the security cameras that Manuel had identified, while Mr. Martinez returned to his regular duties as if nothing had happened. 3 hours later, the story had spread throughout the property. Blake Montgomery and his friends had arrived with pockets full of firecrackers, only to find an empty stall and a note that staff members were already quoting to each other with quiet smiles. William Montgomery, summoned from his breakfast meeting by his furious son, stood reading the note with an unreadable expression. "The girl has spine," he commented to his foreman, loud enough for several workers to overhear. "And more importantly, she's thinking about the investment's value." Blake's face flushed with anger. "She had no right to move him. It's our horse, our property, and a $500,000 animal that you were planning to terrorize with fireworks," his father replied coolly. "Not your most intelligent moment, son." The incident created an unexpected shift in the power dynamics at Fairfield Ranch. While the Montgomery family and their social circle viewed Riley's action as an act of insubordination, the workers saw it differently. That afternoon in the staff dining hall, the usual segregated tables, Latino stable hands in one corner, black groundskeepers in another, kitchen staff at a third, merged for the first time, buzzing with conversation about the girl who outsmarted the young master. "She thinks like the horse," Manuel explained to a rapt audience. She asked herself, "What would frighten me the most?" and then protected him from it. A protective network formed naturally in the following days. When Riley arrived for her morning session with Shadow, she would find the path cleared, gates mysteriously unlocked, equipment conveniently placed. If Blake or his friends appeared, urgent tasks suddenly required their attention elsewhere. When Riley worked with Shadow, someone always happened to be working nearby, ensuring she wouldn't be disturbed. By the beginning of the 6th week, Shadow's transformation was remarkable. The horse that had been deemed dangerous and unmanageable now followed Riley around his paddock like a shadow, a coincidence of name that wasn't lost on the workers who watched them. He still startled at sudden movements and remained wary of strangers, but his trust in Riley had become unshakable. On a golden morning in late April, Riley sat cross-legged in the paddock, reading as always, when Shadow did something extraordinary. After circling the paddock in his usual inspection routine, he approached Riley and, with deliberate care, lowered himself to the ground beside her. Lying down, the ultimate position of vulnerability for a prey animal, he stretched out just a few feet from where she sat. He lay down near her. Mr. Martinez murmured in Spanish to Alma, who had brought him coffee. "Dios mío, I've never seen anything like it." Riley continued reading, her voice steady despite the emotion welling in her chest. Shadow's eyes remained half-closed, his breathing deep and regular, the picture of hard-won tranquility. The next morning, Riley arrived to find a small gathering of workers discreetly observing from a respectful distance. Word had spread about Shadow's breakthrough, and they wanted to witness the miracle for themselves. Even Lucia had switched shifts to be present. As Shadow greeted Riley with a soft nickering sound that had recently entered his vocabulary, she reached into her pocket for his morning apple. After he had accepted it with gentlemanly delicacy, she took a deep breath and attempted what no one had managed since the fire. With slow, deliberate movements, Riley extended her hand toward the scar on Shadow's flank. The horse trembled slightly, but didn't retreat. Her fingers gently touched the mark left by the fire, caressing the irregular hair that had grown over the damaged skin. "You survived," she whispered. "Your scars show your strength, not your weakness." The next day, with heart pounding but hands steady, Riley gave the step no one believed possible. She extended her fingers slowly toward the scar on Shadow's flank, and when her skin touched the mark left by the fire, the horse trembled slightly but remained still, his eyes meeting hers in a moment of mutual understanding that transcended words. Word of Riley's extraordinary connection with Shadow spread beyond Fairfield Ranch like wildfire through Kentucky's horse country. The Lexington Herald ran a front-page story in their Sunday edition with the headline, "The Horse Whisperer of Lexington. Unlikely Connection Defies Experts." The article featured a grainy photo of Riley touching Shadow's scar, taken surreptitiously by someone on the property, and described how a young woman with no formal training was achieving breakthroughs with one of the most traumatized and valuable horses in the region. Blake Montgomery slammed the newspaper onto the dining table with such force that the crystal glasses rattled. "We're becoming a laughingstock," he declared, his face flushed with anger. His father sat at the head of the table, methodically cutting his steak as he considered the article. "The Harringtons asked if we're replacing our professional trainers with cleaning staff," Blake continued, pacing the length of the ornate dining room. "Everyone at the club was talking about it yesterday." William Montgomery dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin before responding. "The girl is getting results," he said pragmatically. "That's what matters." "Results?" Blake laughed bitterly. "She reads children's stories to a horse. That's not training. It's ridiculous." Montgomery studied his son with the same calculating gaze he used to evaluate business opportunities. "The deadline ends in 3 weeks. If she fails to have you riding that horse by then, everything returns to normal." Blake's expression shifted to a smirk. "And if she somehow succeeds, which I doubt, We'll be rid of a problematic investment." Neither man noticed Lucia standing silently in the corner, refilling their water glasses. Later that afternoon, she sought out Riley, who was brushing Shadow in his paddock. "They never intended to honor the agreement," Lucia whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I heard Mr. Montgomery tell his lawyer to find a legal loophole if you actually succeed. He said no homeless girl is walking away with $500,000 on 4 legs from my property." Riley's hand stilled on Shadow's neck. The news was devastating but unsurprising. It was the story of her life, doors closing just when hope appeared. Still, her determination remained unshaken. This was no longer about the challenge or ownership. It was about Shadow and the trust he had placed in her. "Thank you for telling me," Riley said quietly, resuming the long, gentle strokes that kept Shadow calm. The horse leaned slightly into her touch, a behavior that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. "It doesn't change anything. I made a promise to Shadow, not to Montgomery." In the days that followed, Riley intensified her work with Shadow. She began introducing a lightweight saddle during their sessions. Shadow, initially apprehensive, gradually accepted the equipment, provided Riley was the one placing it on his back. She never attempted to mount him. That step would come later, after more groundwork to build his confidence. News of the exceptional progress spread beyond the equestrian community. Journalists appeared at Fairfield Ranch's gates, hoping to glimpse the girl and the untamable horse. Professor Eleanor Thompson from the University of Kentucky's Veterinary College requested permission to document the case for educational purposes. "This is getting out of control," Blake complained to his father in the privacy of the main house's study. The elder Montgomery, who had initially viewed the challenge as harmless entertainment, now recognized the broader implications. If the girl actually succeeded, and the story continued to gain traction, he would be obligated to honor his word or face a public relations disaster. One crisp morning in early May, Riley arrived at her usual time to find Shadow's stable locked with unfamiliar padlocks. A security guard she had never seen before blocked the entrance. "Orders from Mr. Montgomery," he informed her coldly. "No one enters without specific authorization." Stunned, Riley sought out Mr. Martinez, who confirmed the worst. "They've reassigned all your shifts to the west side of the property," he explained, his weathered face creased with concern. "You're no longer to approach Shadow." The news spread rapidly among the workers. During lunch in the staff cafeteria, an unusual silence hung over the tables. The camaraderie that had formed around Riley's work with Shadow had created bonds across usual divisions. Language barriers and job hierarchies temporarily dissolved by their shared investment in this unlikely story of redemption. "It's not fair," muttered one of the young stable hands, pushing his food around his plate. The horse was getting better. An older cook shook her head resignedly. "It's always been this way. They make the rules. We follow them." Riley barely touched her food. "I can't just abandon him," she said softly. "He'll think I betrayed him, like everyone else in his life." It was Manuel who offered the first solution. "I can let you in before dawn, when I switch shifts with Randy. He's always late." Other workers quickly joined the conspiracy. Lucia would provide a kitchen uniform so Riley could move around without raising suspicion. Mr. Martinez would create a distraction in the main stable area during the shift change. The next morning, before the first hint of sunrise, Riley was reunited with Shadow. The horse was visibly agitated upon seeing her, pacing nervously as if afraid she had abandoned him. "I'm sorry I was gone," she whispered, extending her hand slowly. "I promise I won't give up on you." For 3 days, the plan worked flawlessly. Riley spent an hour with Shadow before beginning her reassigned duties in the western section of the property. The horse, anxious for her presence, showed even faster progress, as if understanding the urgency of their situation. On the 4th day, Blake Montgomery appeared unexpectedly during the morning session. Accompanied by 2 security guards, he found Riley adjusting the saddle on Shadow's back. "I knew you wouldn't respect the rules," he said with contempt. "Guards, escort Miss Jenkins off the property. She's banned from returning." What Blake hadn't anticipated was Shadow's reaction. Seeing the men approach Riley in a threatening manner, the horse positioned himself between them, ears flattened in warning, his powerful body tense and protective. "Look at that," Blake commented sarcastically, taking several steps back. "The killer horse is now your protector." Riley was escorted to the main gate, where she received an official trespassing notice. If she returned, she would face criminal charges. The young woman walked the 10 miles back to her foster home in a daze, the reality of the situation crashing down upon her. Without access to Shadow, all their progress would unravel. The horse would interpret her absence as abandonment, another trauma added to his collection. News of Riley's banishment spread like wildfire. In the following 48 hours, an extraordinary thing happened. 4 employees resigned in protest, including Mr. Martinez, who had worked for the family for 2 decades. "I cannot be part of this anymore," he declared as he turned in his uniform. "I've seen horses treated better than people in this place for years, but what they've done to the girl in Shadow crosses a line." Meanwhile, the story leaked to the local press. Sarah Collins, an investigative reporter for the Lexington Herald, began researching Fairfield Ranch's history. She discovered this wasn't the first time William Montgomery had used questionable tactics in his business dealings. In Texas, his oil company had been fined for environmental violations. In the horse world, rumors circulated about abusive training methods hidden from public view. The Lexington equestrian community, initially amused by the story of the stable girl, began to divide. Traditional breeders supported Montgomery, arguing that valuable horses required professional trainers. Others, especially those focused on natural horsemanship methods, defended Riley. Professor Thompson gave an interview stating, "What this young woman achieved with Shadow is extraordinary from a behavioral perspective. Interrupting this process not only harms the animal, but deprives us of valuable knowledge about trauma recovery in equines." Riley, meanwhile, was devastated. Her situation worsened when her foster parents, uncomfortable with the unwanted attention, suggested that maybe it would be better if you found somewhere else to stay. The only consolation came from an unexpected source. Professor Thompson offered Riley a temporary room in her small educational farm outside the city. "We need people with your gift," the professor explained. "I rarely see someone with such natural intuition for equine behavior." At Fairfield Ranch, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Shadow, apparently understanding that Riley had been forced to leave, refused any approach. The few handlers who remained reported that the horse had completely regressed, becoming even more aggressive than before. Blake, determined to prove that his traditional approach would work, attempted to enter the stable with a riding crop. The result was disastrous. Shadow broke through 2 panels of his stall and nearly struck Blake with his hooves. The young man barely escaped injury. "That animal needs to be put down," Blake declared furiously to his father. "It's a danger to everyone." The news reached Riley through Lucia, who maintained secret contact. "They're talking about euthanizing Shadow if he continues like this," she warned over the phone. "Blake is convincing his father it's the only solution." That night, an unexpected thunderstorm hit Lexington. As lightning cut across the sky, Riley made the most difficult decision of her life. With Professor Thompson's help, she drafted an open letter that was published in the morning edition of the Lexington Herald. William Montgomery's challenge was never about a horse or a girl. It was about power versus understanding, force versus patience. Shadow isn't violent by nature. He was traumatized and then treated like a broken machine instead of a living being who suffers. "I publicly challenge Mr. Montgomery to allow me to complete the work we started. If Shadow doesn't accept being ridden by his son in 2 weeks, I'll accept any legal consequences for my previous trespassing. But if I succeed, I ask only that the horse be transferred to a sanctuary where he can be treated with dignity. I don't ask for ownership, only justice." The letter, accompanied by photographic documentation of Shadow's progress and testimonials from former employees, caused a sensation in the local community. Influential breeders, respected veterinarians, and even local politicians began to publicly pressure Montgomery. The final blow came when Sarah Collins published a special report revealing that the fire that had traumatized Shadow had not been accidental. Court documents showed that the investigation had pointed to serious electrical safety failures at the previous owner's facilities, a subsidiary company belonging to none other than William Montgomery. Cornered by public opinion and fearing greater damage to his reputation, Montgomery called a press conference the following day. "In the name of transparency and animal welfare," he declared with visible reluctance, "we invite Ms. Jenkins to return and complete the challenge under the originally established conditions." To everyone's surprise, he added, "And to ensure impartiality, we've invited Professor Eleanor Thompson to supervise the process and document the methods for educational purposes." Blake, standing beside his father on the podium, could barely hide his fury. As the cameras moved away, he whispered to Riley, who was present at the press conference, "This isn't over. That horse will never leave my control." What he didn't know was that Sarah Collins, with her microphone still on, had captured every word of the threat. Sarah Collins's microphone captured every word of Blake's threat, the audio feeding directly into her recorder. She caught Riley's eye across the crowded press room and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The young woman understood. Evidence was being gathered. Allies were forming in unexpected places. Riley's open letter to the Lexington Herald had ignited something in the community that surprised even her. The morning after its publication, she awoke to her phone buzzing with notifications. Local Facebook groups were sharing the letter, with hundreds of comments debating Shadow's situation. A hashtag had emerged overnight. Justice for Shadow. In Keeneland Cafe, a popular breakfast spot for Lexington's equestrian community, heated discussions erupted over coffee and biscuits. The Montgomery boys been handed everything on a silver platter: horses that cost more than most people's homes, trainers flown in from Europe, argued a middle-aged woman in riding boots. "Maybe it's time someone showed that family that money can't solve everything." "But she's just a foster kid with no formal training," countered an older man in a blazer, emblazoned with a prestigious stables logo. "Montgomery's right to protect his investment from amateur handling." "Amateur?" A veterinarian joined the conversation. "I saw the photos. That horse let her touch his burn scar. No amateur achieves that with an animal that traumatized." Sarah Collins moved between these conversations, recorder discreetly capturing the pulse of public opinion. A veteran journalist who had covered Kentucky's horse industry for 15 years, she recognized a story that transcended the usual blue blood rivalries of horse country. This was about power, privilege, and a system that consistently favored those born into wealth over those with natural talent, but no pedigree, much like the horses themselves. Collins began methodically interviewing former Fairfield Ranch employees. Manuel introduced her to his cousin who had quit 6 months earlier after witnessing a trainer use a cattle prod on a difficult mare. A former groom described seeing Blake Montgomery whip a horse that refused to jump until the animal's flanks were striped with welts. "Why didn't you report it?" Collins asked. "Report to who, ma'am?" the groom replied with a bitter laugh. "The local authorities? Half of them are on Montgomery's payroll. The Equestrian Association? His father funds their annual gala." Professor Thompson added scholarly weight to the growing controversy. During a local radio program focused on agricultural issues, the host asked her about the Fairfield Ranch situation. "What this young woman has accomplished represents a paradigm shift in our understanding of equine trauma recovery," Thompson explained. "Shadow displays classic symptoms of PTSD, hypervigilance, reactive aggression, triggered responses to sensory reminders of his trauma. The traditional approach would be sedation, forced desensitization, or euthanasia. Riley Jenkins instead built a relationship based on respect for his trauma response." "But is this scientifically sound?" the host pressed. "Absolutely. Recent research shows that forcing traumatized animals through their triggers often deepens the trauma. Riley's patient approach, allowing Shadow to set the pace of recovery, aligns perfectly with current behavioral science. The shame is that this breakthrough is being threatened by ego and economics rather than being studied and replicated." As the professor's interview circulated online, several influential breeders contacted Montgomery directly. They weren't concerned about Shadow's welfare, as much as the negative publicity the situation created for an industry already under scrutiny for animal welfare issues. "This isn't good for any of us, Will," cautioned Harold Whitfield, whose family had raised Derby winners for 3 generations. "The public already thinks we're all rich folks playing with horses while regular people struggle. This girl's story has underdog against the establishment written all over it." The pressure intensified when an anonymous source provided Sarah Collins with documents about the fire that had traumatized Shadow. Her investigation revealed that the stable where the fire occurred was owned by Meridian Holdings, a shell company that traced back to Montgomery Enterprises. Insurance investigators had flagged serious electrical code violations, but the report had been buried after a substantial settlement. The fire that killed Shadow's original owner and 3 other horses wasn't random bad luck, Collins wrote in her explosive follow-up article. It resulted from documented negligence that was never addressed publicly due to confidential settlements. Cornered by mounting public pressure and potential legal exposure, Montgomery called the press conference that ended with Blake's caught-on-tape threat. By that evening, video clips of the elder Montgomery's reluctant invitation for Riley to return was circulating on social media, alongside audio of Blake's whispered warning. Riley spent that night in Professor Thompson's modest farmhouse, preparing mentally for her return to Fairfield Ranch. Shadow's condition had deteriorated significantly during their separation, according to reports from the remaining sympathetic staff. "He's refusing food," Lucia texted. "Charges anyone who approaches, like the first week he arrived, but worse." "He felt abandoned again," Professor Thompson explained as they sat on her porch planning their approach. "To Shadow, your disappearance likely reinforced his trauma pattern. Those he trusts vanish suddenly, leaving him vulnerable." "How do we rebuild what we lost?" Riley asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Slowly. More slowly than before," Thompson replied. "He's suffering a second betrayal in his mind. We'll need to reconstruct trust from zero." The next morning, Riley and Professor Thompson arrived at Fairfield Ranch as the sun crested the horizon. William Montgomery met them at the main entrance, his usual imperious demeanor tempered by the photographers gathered outside the gates. "Professor, Miss Jenkins," he acknowledged stiffly. "Shadow has been returned to his original paddock. Our staff has been instructed not to interfere with your work." The reunion between Riley and Shadow was nothing like she had hoped. When she approached his paddock, the magnificent black horse retreated to the farthest corner, ears pinned flat against his head. His once curious eyes now held only suspicion and hurt. "He doesn't trust me anymore," Riley whispered, heart sinking. "Give him time," Professor Thompson advised. "Stay where you are. Let him process your return." For nearly an hour, Riley simply sat outside the paddock, not reading, not attempting to engage, just existing in Shadow's space. The horse watched her warily, occasionally pawing the ground in agitation, but made no move to approach. "I failed him," Riley said softly to Thompson. "I promised I wouldn't abandon him. And then I did." "You didn't abandon him. You were forcibly removed," Thompson corrected. "But from his perspective, the result was the same. We need to help him understand you came back as soon as you could." Over the next 3 days, Riley maintained a constant presence near Shadow's paddock. She noticed new defensive behaviors. He now flinched at hand movements that hadn't bothered him before and showed particular agitation when male voices were audible. Blake's attempts to dominate him during Riley's absence had clearly added new layers to his trauma. "He associates men with punishment now," Riley noted in her journal, "especially when they approach from the right side." By the 4th day, Shadow allowed Riley to enter the paddock again, though he maintained his distance. Progress was agonizingly slow compared to their earlier breakthroughs. Each morning, Riley arrived before dawn and often stayed until after sunset, sometimes simply sitting in silence, other times softly reading from Black Beauty, as she had in the beginning. The media presence at Fairfield Ranch grew steadily. Reporters stationed themselves at the property entrance, hoping to capture images of the girl and the traumatized horse. Professor Thompson handled most inquiries, explaining the scientific basis for Riley's methods while protecting the sensitive rehabilitation process from interruption. A week into their renewed work, Riley held an emergency strategy meeting with Professor Thompson and the workers who remained loyal to their cause. "We have 2 weeks left before Montgomery expects Blake to ride him," Riley said, her exhaustion evident in the dark circles under her eyes. "At this rate, we'll barely have Shadow accepting a saddle again by then." "What about trying something different?" suggested Lucia. "Something that shows him you'll never leave him again?" That night, Riley made a decision that raised Professor Thompson's eyebrows. With a camping chair borrowed from Manuel and a sleeping bag provided by Mr. Martinez, she set up outside Shadow's stall after everyone else had left for the night. "You're sleeping here?" Thompson asked, concerned. "He needs to know I'll be here when he wakes up," Riley explained simply. "Every day he expects me to disappear again. I need to break that expectation." Night after night, Riley slept in the chair outside Shadow's stall. Montgomery discovered the arrangement during a late-night inspection, but surprisingly didn't object. Perhaps recognizing the dedication that might salvage his investment, or perhaps mindful of the public relations disaster another ejection would create. Gradually, Shadow began to accept Riley's constant presence. He started taking apples from her hand again, then allowing brief touches to his neck. Still, he shied away from the saddle and showed signs of panic whenever Blake appeared anywhere near the paddock. "He associates Blake with pain now," Riley explained to Professor Thompson. "During my absence, Blake tried to break him the old way." With just 8 days remaining before the deadline, Sarah Collins published another damaging article. Former employees had provided her with video evidence of Blake using a riding crop excessively on several horses. The footage, though not including Shadow, painted a disturbing picture of the young man's approach to animals that challenged his authority. The night before the final challenge, while everyone was leaving the property, Blake entered Shadow's stable silently, riding crop in hand and determination in his eyes. "Tomorrow, no one will humiliate me in front of all of Lexington," he muttered. "Let's make sure you're the monster everyone expects." The sound of Shadow's distressed whinnying echoed across Fairfield Ranch, reaching Riley as she stepped out of Professor Thompson's car the next morning. His cry wasn't the typical greeting she'd come to recognize. This was a sound of pain, of fear renewed. She broke into a run, ignoring the camera crews already setting up near the main arena, racing toward Shadow's stable with her heart hammering against her ribs. She found him pacing frantically, sweat darkening his black coat despite the cool morning air. His breathing came in shallow, rapid bursts, nostrils flared wide, eyes rolling with that terrible whites-showing panic she hadn't seen in weeks. "What happened to him?" Riley demanded as she spotted William and Blake Montgomery already standing outside the stall, watching Shadow's distress with contrasting expressions. Calculation on the father's face, poorly concealed satisfaction on the son's. "Horses get nervous before performances," Blake replied with a dismissive shrug, his custom-made riding boots gleaming in the early sunlight. "Every trainer knows that." But Riley's experienced eyes caught what others might miss: tiny red circles on Shadow's right flank, barely visible against his dark coat. She stepped closer to the stall door, her voice dropping to ensure only Blake could hear. "You whipped him," she accused, fury making her voice tremble. "Last night." Blake's practiced smile faltered for just a heartbeat before reasserting itself. "Prove it." Riley took a deep breath, tamping down the rage that threatened to overwhelm her. Confronting Blake directly would only make things worse for Shadow. Instead, she turned to William Montgomery, her face composed despite the storm inside her. "I need time alone with him before we enter the arena." Montgomery glanced at his gold watch. "The challenge begins in 20 minutes. The cameras are already set up." "Then we'll have to postpone," Riley stated firmly. "Shadow has been deliberately agitated. If we force him now, he could injure himself or someone else." Professor Thompson, who had approached in time to hear the exchange, stepped forward. Her academic authority carried weight even in this environment of wealth and privilege. "As the appointed supervisor, I must insist that the animal's welfare takes precedence. If Miss Jenkins says he needs time, we should respect that assessment." Montgomery evaluated the situation with the cold efficiency that had built his empire. weighing public perception against his desire to maintain control. The gathering crowd, the media presence, the university professor as witness, all factors in an equation that reluctantly led him to concede. 1 hour, he stated, making it clear this was his decision rather than her victory. Not a minute more. As father and son departed, Blake threw a last venomous glance over his shoulder. Riley paid him no mind, her attention already focused entirely on Shadow. Alone with the traumatized horse, she didn't immediately attempt to approach him. Instead, she sat on the clean straw in the corner of his stall, reaching into her backpack for the small radio that had become part of their routine. The gentle strains of Tennessee Waltz filled the stable, not by coincidence. Mr. Martinez's research into Shadow's past had revealed that his original owner, an elderly gentleman from Nashville, had played classic country music in his stables every evening. This particular song had been a favorite, often playing while he groomed his beloved horses. "I know they're trying to separate us," Riley murmured as Shadow's frantic movements gradually slowed with the familiar melody. His ears, previously pinned flat against his head, twitched forward at the sound of her voice. "But I won't give up on you. Never." For 20 minutes, Riley simply existed in Shadow's space, allowing the music to work its magic. She didn't approach, didn't make demands, just provided the consistency he desperately needed after another betrayal. Gradually, his breathing steadied. The wild look in his eyes subsided, replaced by cautious recognition. When Professor Thompson quietly appeared at the stall door, she found Riley still seated in the same position, Shadow now standing still, his focus entirely on the young woman. "Remarkable," Thompson whispered. "His cortisol levels must have been off the charts earlier. How did you bring him down so quickly?" "Memory association," Riley explained, careful to keep her voice low and even. "His first owner played this music. It connects him to safety, to the time before the fire." With gentle patience, Riley slowly rose to her feet, maintaining constant verbal contact with Shadow. "We're going to show them something different today," she told him softly. "Not what they expect, just truth." When they finally entered the main arena, a murmur rippled through the assembled crowd. Shadow, though still visibly tense, stayed close to Riley, as if she were his only anchor in a threatening world. His ears flicked constantly, monitoring every sound, but he no longer showed the blind panic of earlier. William Montgomery, immaculate in his tailored suit, strode to the center of the arena with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final challenge," he announced, his voice amplified by the microphone system. "As you all know, nearly 2 months ago, I proposed that if Miss Jenkins could enable my son to ride this previously unmanageable horse, the animal would be hers. Today, we will witness whether unconventional methods can overcome traditional training." Blake waited at the side of the arena, fully outfitted in professional riding gear, his expression confident. He believed the previous night's session with the riding crop had ensured Shadow would never allow anyone near him, much less on his back. To everyone's surprise, Riley did not follow the expected protocol. Instead of immediately preparing Shadow for mounting, she calmly sat down in the center of the arena, her back to the horse, and began to sing softly, the same Tennessee Waltz melody that had played in the stable. Confused murmurs rippled through the audience. Blake laughed openly. "This is ridiculous." Professor Thompson signaled for silence, her academic authority silencing even the wealthy spectators. Gradually, something extraordinary began to unfold. Shadow, who had initially maintained his distance, started approaching Riley of his own accord. In a moment that seemed to suspend time itself, the massive black stallion walked to where she sat and gently touched his head to her shoulder. "My God," someone whispered from the stands. With slow, deliberate movements, Riley stood and stroked Shadow's neck. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she led the horse to the side of the arena where Blake waited. Absolute silence fell over the venue. Even William Montgomery, typically impassive, leaned forward in his special seat at the front of the stands. "He's ready," Riley announced, but instead of handing the reins to Blake, She looked directly into the arrogant young man's eyes and said in a voice clear enough to be heard by all, "But he needs to choose who rides him, just as we all deserve to choose who guides us." Blake, disconcerted by the expectant silence of the crowd, reached for the reins. Shadow immediately backed away, ears flattening in alarm. "See? He's still dangerous," Blake accused. Riley remained calm. "Perhaps he remembers the pain you caused last night." "What are you talking about?" Blake attempted to maintain his composure, but his voice wavered perceptibly. "The whip marks on his flank," Riley replied, pointing to the small wounds now more visible in the direct sunlight. "Shadow has memory, as we all do." A murmur of indignation swept through the audience. Professor Thompson quickly approached to examine the animal, confirming Riley's accusations with a solemn nod. Blake, cornered, looked to his father for support. But William Montgomery, ever mindful of public consequences, maintained a neutral expression. Blake hesitated, his face flushed with shame and anger. Then, in a moment of frustrated rage, he exploded. "That damn horse would never accept being ridden. I just wanted to prove this whole thing is a farce." The silence following his confession was deafening. Cameras recorded every word, every reaction. Sarah Collins smiled discreetly as her videographer captured the entire scene. William Montgomery, recognizing the public relations disaster unfolding, quickly intervened. He approached the center of the arena, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "It appears we have an unforeseen situation," he declared in his businessman's voice. "Obviously, we cannot proceed with the challenge under these circumstances." Riley, still standing beside Shadow, held her ground. "The challenge was to have your son ride Shadow, but now we see the problem was never the horse. It was who was trying to control him." Montgomery rapidly assessed the situation, the cameras, the crowd, the indignant comments already circulating. With the pragmatism that had made him successful, he made the decision that would best serve his public image. "Miss Jenkins," he announced with a forced smile, "you've demonstrated an extraordinary understanding of equine behavior. As promised, Shadow now belongs to you." The audience erupted in applause. Blake stalked away furiously, followed by his equally embarrassed friends. But Riley surprised everyone once more. "Mr. Montgomery, I don't want to own Shadow. I want him to have the chance to live without fear, without being treated as property or an investment." Montgomery frowned, confused. "What are you suggesting?" "I propose that Shadow be transferred to the University of Kentucky's Equine Recovery Sanctuary," Riley responded, looking toward Professor Thompson, who nodded in support. "There, he can help students understand trauma and recovery in horses, and I would like to work with him as part of the program." A new wave of applause, even more enthusiastic, echoed through the arena. William Montgomery, recognizing an opportunity to transform defeat into public victory, quickly adapted. "Indeed, an excellent suggestion. In fact, the Montgomery Foundation will be pleased to announce a donation of $1 million to the new Shadow program at the University of Kentucky, focused on recovery for traumatized horses." Camera flashes intensified. Montgomery, a master at manipulating narratives, was already transforming disaster into a public relations opportunity. As the crowd began to disperse, Professor Thompson approached Riley, who was still stroking Shadow's neck. "You know you just refused ownership of a $500,000 horse, right?" Riley smiled, watching Shadow relaxed beside her. "It was never about owning him. It was about freeing him, and myself, in the process." The professor studied the young woman for a moment. "Have you ever considered studying veterinary medicine? We have a scholarship program for exceptional students." Cornered by the evidence of abuse and Shadow's undeniable reaction, Blake lost control. "That damn horse would never accept being ridden. I just wanted to prove this whole thing is a farce." His confession echoing through the arena's sound system, while cameras recorded every word, every reaction, creating a moment that no Montgomery fortune could erase. A heavy silence fell over the arena as Blake's confession echoed through the sound system. The assembled crowd, Wealthy breeders, curious locals, and media representatives seemed to collectively hold their breath. Sarah Collins's cameraman panned across the faces, capturing the shock and disapproval rippling through the stands. Blake Montgomery stood frozen in the center of the arena, the realization of his public admission washing over him like cold water. William Montgomery moved with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to crisis management. He stepped forward, placing a steadying hand on his son's shoulder, his face composed into a neutral mask that revealed nothing of the fury he undoubtedly felt. "It appears we have an unexpected situation," Montgomery announced, his voice carrying across the now silent arena. "Obviously, we cannot proceed with the challenge under the current circumstances." Riley remained beside Shadow, one hand resting gently on his neck. The horse's ears flicked nervously at the tension in the air. But he stayed beside her, his trust in her presence stronger than his fear of the crowd. "Mr. Montgomery," Riley said, her voice clear and unwavering despite her racing heart. "The challenge was for your son to ride Shadow. But perhaps we've all discovered something more important today, that the problem was never with the horse." Montgomery assessed the situation with the calculating gaze that had built his fortune. Cameras were recording every moment, social media was undoubtedly already buzzing, and witnesses from Lexington's most influential families were watching intently. With the pragmatism that defined his business dealings, he made the decision that would best serve his public image. "Miss Jenkins," he announced with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "you've demonstrated extraordinary understanding of equine behavior. As promised, Shadow now belongs to you." A wave of applause swept through the arena. Blake pulled away from his father's grip and stalked toward the exit, followed by his embarrassed friends. The crowd's approval was palpable. Everyone loved an underdog story, especially in Kentucky where horse legends were cherished cultural touchstones. But Riley surprised everyone once more. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, "I don't want to own Shadow." The applause faltered, confused murmurs replacing it. Montgomery's practiced smile flickered. "I beg your pardon?" "I don't want to possess him," Riley continued, her hand still steady on Shadow's neck. "I want him to have the chance to live without fear, without being treated as property or an investment." She turned slightly, looking toward Professor Thompson, who stood at the edge of the arena. "I propose that Shadow be transferred to the University of Kentucky's Equine Recovery Sanctuary. There, he can help students understand trauma and recovery in horses, and I would like to work with him as part of the program." Professor Thompson stepped forward, nodding her approval. "Our facility has the resources to continue Shadow's rehabilitation while advancing our understanding of equine psychology. His case could help countless other traumatized animals." A new wave of applause, even more enthusiastic than before, filled the arena. Montgomery's expression shifted as he recognized an opportunity to transform a public relations disaster into a victory. He stepped forward, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. "An excellent suggestion," he declared magnanimously. "In fact, the Montgomery Foundation will be pleased to announce a donation of $1 million to establish the new Shadow program at the University of Kentucky, focused on recovery for traumatized horses." Camera flashes intensified as reporters scribbled notes. Montgomery, master of narrative manipulation, was already reshaping the story, not as the exposure of his son's cruelty, but as a philanthropic triumph. As the crowd began to disperse, media representatives swarming toward Montgomery for statements, Professor Thompson approached Riley, who remained quietly with Shadow. "You know you just refused ownership of a $500,000 horse, right?" she asked, a mixture of admiration and disbelief in her voice. Riley smiled, watching Shadow's now calm demeanor as he stood beside her, his breathing steady and even. "It was never about owning him," she replied softly. "It was about freeing him, and myself, in the process." The professor studied the young woman thoughtfully. "Have you ever considered studying veterinary medicine? We have a scholarship program for exceptional students." Riley's eyes widened. I've always wanted to, but the tuition—" "Let me worry about that," Thompson said with a warm smile. Students with your natural understanding of animal behavior are precisely who we need in the field. In the days that followed, Riley's story dominated local media and spread through national equestrian publications. Sarah Collins's comprehensive article, titled "The Girl Who Whispered Truths," won a regional journalism award and exposed many of the questionable practices in the elite equestrian industry. The piece detailed not only Shadow's remarkable transformation under Riley's care, but also the systemic issues that allowed wealthy owners to treat animals as disposable commodities. Shadow's isolated stable was transformed into the first building of the new equine recovery sanctuary on the university grounds. Within weeks, traumatized horses from across the country began arriving, survivors of fires, floods, accidents, and abuse. Each case presented unique challenges, but the principles Riley had discovered with Shadow formed the foundation of their approach. 3 months after the confrontation at Fairfield Ranch, Riley sat in Professor Thompson's office, overwhelmed by how dramatically her life had changed. From a foster child cleaning stables to a first-year veterinary student with a full scholarship, she now divided her time between classes and work at the sanctuary. "Your approach is becoming something of a protocol," Thompson explained, showing Riley the preliminary draft of a paper they were co-authoring. "The combination of environmental consistency, sensory recognition therapy, and trauma-informed handling is showing remarkable results with our newest arrivals." "Shadow taught me everything," Riley said, glancing out the window to where the black stallion grazed peacefully in a paddock designed specifically for his rehabilitation. "I just listened." William Montgomery, ever attentive to trends, publicly embraced more humane training methods at Fairfield Ranch, though many suspected little had changed behind the scenes. His $1 million donation had bought him a position on the sanctuary's advisory board, a move Professor Thompson had reluctantly accepted for the financial security it provided their program. Blake had been quietly sent to manage family business interests in Europe, away from the critical eyes that now followed him in Kentucky. The video of his confession had gone viral in equestrian circles, making him something of a pariah among those who once courted his friendship. On a golden autumn afternoon, as the sun began to set over the rolling bluegrass fields, Riley led a group of children from the foster care system on a tour of the sanctuary. Shadow, now significantly calmer and more confident, approached the fence where the children waited eagerly. "He didn't have a family either," Riley explained to the wide-eyed visitors. "But now we're all his family, and he's part of ours." A small girl, approximately 5 years old, looked up at Riley with serious eyes. "How did you know he could get better? Everyone said he was bad." Riley smiled, remembering all the times she'd heard similar words about herself. "Because sometimes people mistake fear for anger and pain for badness. He was never bad, just scared and alone." The children watched in awe as Shadow gently accepted an apple from Riley's hand, his movements now fluid and relaxed where once they had been jagged with tension. His coat gleamed with health, the scar on his flank now less prominent against his glossy black hair. That evening, after everyone had departed, Riley saddled Shadow for the first time without any assistance. Together they rode through the open fields of the sanctuary, not in a dramatic gallop from a movie, but in a steady, confident rhythm of partners who had found each other when they needed it most. The gentle Kentucky wind caressed Shadow's shining black coat and Riley's loose hair as they moved under the starlit sky. They were no longer a girl without a place and a horse without hope, but two survivors who, together, had redefined the meaning of freedom, trust, and home. Later that week, Riley sat at her small desk in the dormitory, working on the introduction to Professor Thompson's book. Her fingers paused over the keyboard as she considered how to express what Shadow had taught her. "The scars never completely disappear, in horses or in humans," she typed. "But when we stop trying to hide them and learn to accept them as part of our story, they cease to define us and begin to remind us of our capacity for healing." Shadow taught me that true freedom isn't about escaping the past, but about riding alongside it, acknowledging it without allowing it to determine our future. As Riley prepared for bed that night, she noticed an envelope that had been slipped under her door. Inside was a newspaper clipping about suspected animal welfare violations at other Montgomery-owned properties, along with several disturbing photographs of horses in questionable conditions. A handwritten note accompanied the materials. Shadow's story was just the tip of the iceberg. There are others who need you. Riley stared at the photographs, her heart pounding. Just when she thought she had found her path forward, the past reached out again, reminding her that for every Shadow who found redemption, countless others remained trapped in cycles of abuse protected by wealth and influence. Setting the envelope on her desk, she made a silent promise to the anonymous sender. The work was far from over. 3 months after the confrontation at Fairfield Ranch, while Riley organized her small desk in the university's veterinary laboratory, she received an unmarked envelope containing disturbing photos of other horses in suspicious conditions at properties linked to the Montgomerys, along with an anonymous note. Shadow's story was just the tip of the iceberg. There are others who need you. Riley stared at the disturbing photographs spread across her dormitory desk, the harsh morning light revealing details she wished she could unsee. Horses with protruding ribs, open sores from ill-fitting equipment, and the vacant stare of animals who had given up hope. The envelope had arrived 3 days ago, and she had barely slept since. "Who sent these?" Professor Thompson asked, examining the images with a grim expression. The older woman had arrived minutes earlier, summoned by Riley's urgent text. "No return address, no signature," Riley replied, handing over the anonymous note. "But they knew about Shadow, knew where to find me." Thompson studied the photos carefully, her practiced veterinarian's eye cataloging the visible signs of neglect and abuse. "These facilities appear to be Montgomery-affiliated. I recognize the distinctive fencing design they use at all their properties." She sighed, removing her reading glasses. Sarah Collins mentioned she was investigating other Montgomery holdings. Perhaps this came from one of her sources. A knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah Collins entered, her reporter's notebook already in hand. "I see you got the package too," she said, noticing the photos. "My editor received identical copies yesterday morning." "Are these properties under investigation?" Riley asked. Collins nodded. 3 separate facilities in Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina, all officially owned by different corporations, but the paper trail leads back to Montgomery Enterprises. We've been following leads for weeks, but gathering concrete evidence has been challenging. The Montgomerys have friends in every regulatory agency. Riley glanced out her window toward the sanctuary where Shadow grazed peacefully in the morning sun. In the 4 months since starting at the university, she had settled into a rhythm. Classes in the morning, afternoons at the sanctuary, evenings studying. Shadow had become the centerpiece of Professor Thompson's new program, his remarkable recovery drawing attention from veterinary scholars across the country. "What can we do?" Riley asked, turning back to the women. "For now, we document everything," Collins replied. "Build an irrefutable case. The photos are compelling, but we need more." Later that afternoon, Riley stood in the observation area as a visiting trainer worked with Shadow. The horse had grown accustomed to carefully vetted visitors, part of his ongoing socialization. Today's visitor was Marcus Wells, a renowned equine behaviorist from California who had requested to observe Shadow's rehabilitation protocol. Riley noticed the change instantly. Shadow, who had greeted the previous 3 visitors with cautious acceptance, suddenly froze when Wells entered the paddock. His ears flattened, nostrils flared, and his entire body tensed as if preparing to flee. "Stop!" Riley called out, moving quickly into the paddock. "Something's wrong." Wells halted, maintaining a professional calm. "He's showing classic defensive posturing. Has he reacted this way to male visitors before?" "Never this severely," Riley answered, positioning herself between Shadow and Wells. The horse was trembling now, his breathing rapid and shallow, signs Riley recognized from their earliest interactions. "I'm sorry, but I think we should end this session." After Wells departed, Riley remained with Shadow, gently stroking his neck until his breathing normalized. His reaction puzzled her. They had carefully introduced him to dozens of strangers over the past months, and while he remained cautious around men, he hadn't shown such intense fear in weeks. "What was it about him?" she murmured, making mental notes for her journal. "What did you see that I missed?" That evening, Riley searched online for information about Marcus Wells. His credentials were impressive: 20 years of experience, publications in respected journals, testimonials from wealthy clients. Nothing seemed unusual until she found a photograph from 5 years earlier, Wells receiving an award at an equestrian event in Kentucky. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, stood the previous owner of the property where Shadow had survived the fire. "Professor," Riley called early the next morning, "I need to see the complete file on Shadow's history." In Thompson's office, they spread out the documents: veterinary records, insurance papers, ownership transfers. Most had been provided by Montgomery when Shadow was transferred to the sanctuary, with additional materials gathered during their research for the program. "There," Riley pointed to a staff roster from Shadow's previous stable. "Marcus Wells was a consulting trainer there for 6 months before the fire." Thompson frowned. "He never mentioned knowing Shadow when he requested the visit." "Because he didn't want us to know," Riley replied, her mind racing. Shadow recognized him, not just as a stranger but as someone associated with his earlier trauma. Over the next week, Riley dove into an investigation of Shadow's past. She interviewed former employees from the Burns stable, combed through local newspaper archives, and reviewed the insurance investigation report Sarah Collins had obtained. The picture that emerged was troubling. Shadow wasn't just traumatized by the fire, Riley explained to Professor Thompson as they watched the horse from the observation deck. According to 3 separate handlers I spoke with, he was exhibiting fear responses months before the incident. One remembered him being particularly terrified of a specific training tool, a particular type of whip that wasn't commonly used at that facility. "And Wells?" Thompson asked. "Was known for using that exact tool," Riley confirmed. "He specialized in problem horses, animals that didn't respond to conventional training. His methods were effective, but harsh." The revelation shifted their understanding of Shadow's trauma. It wasn't just the catastrophic event of the fire that had damaged him. There had been a foundation of fear already established through abusive training techniques. Riley adjusted her approach based on this new information. She began identifying specific triggers that might be connected to Shadow's pre-fire experiences. Certain sounds, specific equipment, even particular times of day seemed to elicit stronger fear responses than others. "He's not just reacting to reminders of the fire," she explained to a group of veterinary students during a demonstration session. "He's carrying layered trauma, the chronic stress of abusive training overlaid with the acute trauma of the fire itself." Using this deeper understanding, Riley developed what the students began calling the Shadow Protocol, a systematic approach to identifying different types of trauma in horses and creating individualized recovery plans. Professor Thompson documented each step meticulously, incorporating Riley's intuitive insights with scientific measurements of stress hormones, heart rate variability, and behavioral markers. "What makes your approach unique," Thompson told Riley as they reviewed the latest data, "is that you're not just addressing the symptoms, you're looking for the story behind them." In late October, the sanctuary received its second severely traumatized resident, a gray mare rescued from a hoarding situation where 40 horses had been found starving in filthy conditions. Willow, as the students named her, exhibited many of the same defensive behaviors as Shadow had initially shown, though the triggers were different. "Notice how she responds differently to food than Shadow did," Riley pointed out during a training session. Shadow was suspicious of food rewards, likely because they had been used to trick him into accepting painful procedures. Willow gorges desperately, showing food insecurity from prolonged starvation. Working with both horses, Riley began establishing patterns and categorizing different types of equine trauma responses. Shadow became an unexpected assistant in Willow's rehabilitation. His calm presence seemed to reassure the mare when they were placed in adjacent paddocks. "He's showing her it's safe here," Riley explained to the students observing the interaction. "Horses are herd animals. They take social cues from each other about danger and safety." As word of the Shadow Protocol spread, the sanctuary began receiving requests for educational visits. One November afternoon, the local social services office contacted Professor Thompson about bringing a group of children from the foster care system for a therapeutic visit. "They've heard about your background," Thompson told Riley. "They think meeting you and the horses might be particularly meaningful for these kids." The day of the visit arrived with perfect fall weather, crisp air, golden sunlight filtering through the remaining red and orange leaves. Riley had prepared carefully, making sure both Shadow and Willow were comfortable with the planned activities. 8 children arrived, ranging in age from 5 to 16, accompanied by 2 social workers. "These horses have something in common with you," Riley explained as the group gathered at a safe distance from the paddock. "They've had to leave homes that weren't safe and learn to trust new people. It's not always easy." The children listened with solemn attention. A teenage boy at the back of the group asked, "Did they get scared when they came here?" "Very scared," Riley answered honestly. "Shadow wouldn't let anyone touch him for weeks. He thought everyone wanted to hurt him because that's what he had experienced before." Riley demonstrated some of the gentler techniques they used, sitting quietly near the horses without demands, using calm voices, moving predictably. To everyone's surprise, Shadow approached the fence where the children stood, his curiosity overtaking his usual caution with strangers. "He wants to meet you," Riley said, showing the children how to offer their palms flat with apple slices. Most of the children eagerly participated, giggling as Shadow's soft muzzle tickled their hands. One girl, however, remained apart from the group. About 8 years old, with dark braids and serious eyes, she watched from a distance, arms crossed protectively over her chest. Riley recognized the body language immediately. It mirrored Shadow's defensive posturing. Without drawing attention to the girl, Riley sat on a nearby bench, creating space while remaining available. "Some days Shadow doesn't want to be touched," she commented casually as the other children continued interacting with the horses. "We respect that. Everyone gets to decide about their own space." The girl drifted closer, not to the horses but to Riley. "They said you lived in foster homes too," she said quietly. 8 different ones, Riley confirmed. "I'm on my 4th, the girl replied. "They keep sending me back because I'm difficult." Shadow was labeled dangerous and unmanageable, Riley told her. But it wasn't his fault. He was just trying to protect himself. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the others. Then, to the astonishment of the social workers, the girl who had refused to participate in any group activities for months asked, "Can I sit with Shadow like you do in the pictures?" Just sitting, not touching. Riley arranged a supervised session, creating a safe distance while allowing the girl to experience the quiet presence technique that had been so effective with Shadow. The horse, sensing something familiar in the child's caution, approached slowly and stood nearby, respecting her boundaries while offering connection. "He knows," whispered one of the social workers to Professor Thompson. "Somehow he knows she needs the same thing he did." As the group prepared to leave, the quiet girl approached Riley. "Does it get better?" she asked simply. "It did for Shadow," Riley answered. "And for me. Not all at once, but little by little." On her door that evening, Riley found another envelope, this one containing a faded sepia photograph of a young woman with a horse, along with a handwritten note. "Your mother had the same gift. She was going to change everything before the accident," and a signature that made her heart stop. "Eleanor Jenkins, your grandmother." Riley's hands trembled as she held the photograph, studying the faded sepia image of a woman whose features mirrored her own, the same determined set of the jaw, the same slight tilt of the head when facing a challenge. The woman stood beside a dappled gray horse, one hand resting on its neck in the exact manner Riley often touched Shadow. The handwriting on the note was elegant, but slightly shaky, suggesting an elderly hand. "Eleanor Jenkins," Riley whispered the name aloud, testing its reality. "My grandmother." She had spent countless hours in foster care imagining relatives who might claim her, fantasizing about grandparents who didn't know she existed, aunts and uncles searching for their lost niece. As the years passed, those dreams had faded, replaced by the hard reality that she was truly alone. Until now. Sleep proved impossible that night. Riley sat cross-legged on her bed, examining the photograph under her desk lamp, searching for clues. The woman, her mother Catherine, appeared to be in her 20s, standing before a stable that looked vaguely familiar. The horse nuzzled her shoulder with the comfortable familiarity of a long-established trust. At dawn, Riley called Professor Thompson. "I need to take a personal day," she explained, her voice uncharacteristically unsteady. "Something's come up." After a moment's hesitation, she added, "I think I found my grandmother." The address on the envelope led Riley to a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of Lexington. The small property was well maintained but humble, white clapboard with faded blue shutters, a wraparound porch sporting a collection of mismatched rocking chairs, and behind it, a small barn and paddock where an elderly chestnut mare grazed peacefully. Riley sat in the borrowed university truck for several minutes, gathering her courage. The doorbell's chime sounded oddly festive against the gravity of the moment. She heard slow footsteps approaching from inside. Then the door opened to reveal a woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that stopped Riley's breath. They were her own eyes, looking back at her across generations. "I've been waiting for you to find me," Eleanor Jenkins said simply, as if this meeting were the most natural thing in the world. "Come in, Riley." The living room walls told the story that had been denied to Riley her entire life. Photographs chronicled a family's history in the horse world. Ribbons, trophies, and framed newspaper clippings spoke of respected professionals across generations. In one corner stood a display case holding silver cups engraved with the name Eleanor Jenkins and dates from the 1960s and 70s. "You were a trainer," Riley said, examining the awards. "One of the first women to compete professionally in Kentucky," Eleanor confirmed, lowering herself carefully into an armchair. "Your mother followed in my footsteps, had even more natural talent than I did." She gestured toward a particular photograph, Catherine Jenkins accepting a trophy, her smile radiant. "That was 6 months before she met your father, 3 years before the accident." Riley's throat tightened. What really happened to her? Eleanor's weathered hands tightened around the teacup she held. The official report said she lost control of her car on Versailles Road during a rainstorm. But Catherine was an excellent driver, and she'd been making noise about dangerous training practices at certain stables. Her eyes met Riley's directly. Stables owned by people with enough money and influence to make problems disappear. The pieces began to fall into place. Shadow's story, the Montgomery connection, her mother's investigation, and now these photographs linking their family across generations to Kentucky's horse world. "Why didn't you find me after she died?" The question that had haunted Riley's entire life finally emerged, her voice barely above a whisper. Pain flashed across Eleanor's face. "I tried. God knows I tried. I filed for guardianship immediately, but there were complications. Your birth certificate didn't list a father, which should have made things straightforward, but suddenly a man appeared claiming paternity." "What man?" "I never met any father. Thomas Blackwell, a business associate of the Montgomerys, conveniently. He established just enough legal claim to muddy the waters, drag out the proceedings. Then my husband, your grandfather, had a stroke. Medical bills piled up. The legal fees became impossible." Eleanor's voice broke. "By the time I could regroup, you had disappeared into the system. My attorney found indications your records had been deliberately obscured." Riley's mind reeled with the implications. "Are you saying the Montgomerys were behind this? But why? What could they possibly gain from keeping a 5-year-old from her grandmother?" Eleanor rose slowly and moved to a roll-top desk in the corner. From a hidden compartment, she extracted a leather-bound journal. "Your mother kept detailed records of everything she observed. She was methodical that way." Eleanor handed the journal to Riley. "After the accident, I found this hidden in her apartment. I've kept it safe, hoping someday you would come looking for answers." Riley opened the journal with trembling fingers. Inside, her mother's handwriting filled page after page with observations about training techniques, injury reports, medication records, and documentation of systematic abuse at facilities linked to Montgomery Enterprises. She was gathering evidence of illegal practices, Eleanor explained. Drugs to mask injuries, falsified breeding records, insurance fraud, and worse, deliberate harm to animals that weren't performing. A month before she died, she told me she finally had enough to go public. Later that afternoon, Riley sat on Eleanor's porch, trying to process everything she'd learned. The chestnut mare had wandered up to the fence, curious about the visitor. Eleanor joined her, carrying 2 glasses of sweet tea. "Her name is Penny," Eleanor said, nodding toward the horse. "Last of my training stock, 32 years old now." Riley watched the elderly mare, noticing how she moved with the stiffness of advanced age, but maintained the dignified bearing of a well-trained horse. "She's beautiful." "She was your mother's first serious competition mount," Eleanor replied. "Won the Lexington Classic together when Catherine was just 17. She sipped her tea. "Horses were in your blood long before you met Shadow. Did you know about him? About what I've been doing?" Eleanor smiled. "I've followed your story from the beginning. When I saw the first newspaper article about the girl who connected with the traumatized stallion at Fairfield Ranch, I knew immediately you were Catherine's daughter. You have her gift. Why didn't you come forward then? Would you have believed a stranger claiming to be your grandmother after all those years in foster care?" Eleanor shook her head. "I had to wait until you were ready to find me. When you started the Shadow program and it gained publicity, I knew the time was coming." The next morning, Riley brought Sarah Collins to meet Eleanor. The journalist listened intently as the older woman shared her suspicions about Catherine's death and presented her daughter's journal. "This corroborates much of what my sources have told me," Collins said, carefully examining the pages, "and it provides historical context, showing these aren't isolated incidents, but a pattern spanning decades." She looked up at Riley. "With your permission, I'd like to reopen the investigation into your mother's accident." "Do it," Riley said firmly. "It's time for the truth." Back at the university, Riley shared her discoveries with Professor Thompson. The older woman listened with growing concern as Riley connected the dots between her mother's investigations, Shadow's trauma, and the broader pattern of abuse. "Catherine Jenkins," Thompson murmured. "I remember her work now. She published several innovative papers on stress responses in competition horses. The academic community was shocked when she died so young." She squeezed Riley's hand. "She would be extraordinarily proud of you." Together, they incorporated Catherine's observations into the Shadow Protocol, discovering that many of her mother's techniques from 20 years earlier aligned perfectly with Riley's intuitive approaches. The journal provided scientific validation for methods Riley had developed through pure empathy and observation. As the Shadow program expanded, Riley divided her time between her studies, the sanctuary, and visits to Eleanor's farm. Together they reviewed Catherine's research, with Eleanor filling in the personal stories behind the clinical notes. "She was fearless," Eleanor recalled one evening as they sat reviewing photographs. "When she identified a problem, she confronted it head-on, regardless of whose toes she stepped on." "Is that what got her killed?" Riley asked quietly. Eleanor's silence was answer enough. In early December, Riley brought Shadow to meet Eleanor. The university had initially hesitated at moving their star patient, but Professor Thompson supported the request, recognizing its therapeutic value for both horse and handler. Eleanor stood at the fence as the trailer arrived, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He moves just like midnight," she observed as Shadow cautiously explored the unfamiliar paddock. "Your mother's last stallion." Riley noticed how Shadow's ears pricked forward at Eleanor's voice. Despite his usual wariness of strangers, he approached the fence where the elderly woman stood. Perhaps he sensed the connection, the shared bloodline between this woman and the girl he trusted. As winter settled over Kentucky, bringing frost to the bluegrass and quiet to the breeding farms, Riley established a new routine. Weekdays were devoted to her studies and the expanding shadow program, while weekends found her at Eleanor's farm, absorbing the family history she'd been denied and helping maintain the small property. The investigation into Catherine's death gained momentum when Sarah Collins published a comprehensive article linking Montgomery Enterprises to a series of suspicious accidents involving industry whistleblowers. The piece stopped short of directly accusing the family of Catherine's death, but presented enough circumstantial evidence to raise serious questions. "They're feeling the pressure," Collins told Riley during a phone call. "William Montgomery has hired a crisis management team, and Blake is being kept in Europe indefinitely." One crisp December morning, Riley and Eleanor visited Catherine's grave together for the first time. They placed wildflowers, Catherine's favorite, against the simple headstone. "I'll finish what she started," Riley promised, her breath visible in the cold air. "She would want you to be careful," Eleanor cautioned. "These people have resources and influence we can only imagine." That evening, as they sat by the fireplace reviewing more of Catherine's research, Riley's phone rang. The sanctuary's night supervisor sounded panicked. "You need to come immediately," he urged. "It's Shadow. Something's terribly wrong. He's refusing food and water, pacing frantically. We've never seen him like this." "Did something frighten him?" Riley was already reaching for her coat. "That's just it. Nothing happened. No triggers. No changes to his routine. He was fine at evening check, and 30 minutes later, he was in complete distress. Dr. Thompson says to tell you it's like he knows something we don't." Riley's blood ran cold as she remembered Shadow's extraordinary sensitivity, his almost supernatural awareness of danger. She locked eyes with Eleanor, whose expression mirrored her own growing dread. The investigation into Catherine Jenkins reopened officially when Sarah Collins published an explosive report connecting her accident to a series of incidents involving people who had investigated equestrian industry practices. And as the legal implications unfolded, Riley received an urgent call from the sanctuary. Shadow was in inexplicable panic, refusing food and water. Something was deeply wrong. Riley's heart hammered against her ribs as she raced toward the sanctuary, Eleanor following in her own car. The night had turned bitter cold, with a light dusting of snow beginning to fall across the Kentucky landscape. Campus buildings stood silent and dark against the midnight sky as she sped down the service road to the stable complex. Even before she reached Shadow's paddock, she could hear his distressed whinnying, a sound she hadn't heard since those first terrible days after the fire. She found him pacing frantically, his black coat slick with sweat despite the freezing temperature. His eyes rolled wildly, showing too much white, the unmistakable sign of equine panic. "How long has he been like this?" Riley demanded, dropping her bag and immediately entering the paddock despite the warning calls from the night supervisor. "Almost 2 hours now," answered Dr. Cooper, the on-call veterinarian. "Vitals are elevated but not critical. We considered sedation, but Professor Thompson insisted we wait for you." Professor Thompson stood at the fence, her face grave. "Something triggered him, Riley. Not external. I've reviewed the security footage. Nothing unusual happened in or around his paddock. This is coming from inside." Riley approached Shadow cautiously, her movements slow and deliberate despite her racing thoughts. "Hey boy," she called softly. "I'm here now." Shadow continued pacing, but his ears flicked toward her voice. Riley positioned herself in his path, not blocking him, but making her presence unavoidable. When he came around again, he slowed, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. "That's it," she murmured. "Focus on me." Gradually, she raised her hand to his forehead. His skin burned hot beneath her palm, tremors running through his powerful frame. Looking into his eyes, Riley saw something she recognized immediately, not just fear, but warning. "He's trying to tell us something," she said, her voice barely audible. Professor Thompson joined her in the paddock, moving with the same careful precision. "Like the night of the fire? Animals often sense danger before humans do. Check the other horses," Riley instructed the staff hovering near the fence. "See if anyone else is agitated." The report came back quickly. Only Shadow showed signs of distress. This was specific to him, not a general threat to the stable. Riley stayed with him through the night, refusing offers to take breaks. She employed every technique in their established routine: the soft country music that reminded him of his first home, the measured cadence of her reading voice, her steady presence beside him without demands. By dawn, his pacing had slowed, though the wild look remained in his eyes. As weak morning light filtered through the stable windows, Eleanor arrived with coffee and a troubled expression. Sarah Collins called. Someone broke into her office at the newspaper last night. The files on Montgomery and your mother's case are gone. Riley's blood ran cold. When exactly? Between 10 and midnight, they think. That's when Shadow started panicking. Riley looked at the horse, who had finally settled enough to drink water. He knew. Professor Thompson frowned. That's not possible. How could he? I don't know how, Riley interrupted. But he did. He's been trying to warn us. Before they could discuss it further, Riley's phone rang, an unfamiliar number with a local area code. Riley Jenkins? A male voice asked when she answered. Yes. This is Detective Michaels, Lexington Police. We need you to come to the University Medical Center immediately. Blake Montgomery has returned from Europe and there's been an incident. Riley exchanged alarmed glances with Eleanor and Professor Thompson. What kind of incident? I'd rather not discuss it over the phone, ma'am. Please come as soon as possible. At the hospital, Detective Michaels, a solid man with graying temples and tired eyes, met them in a private consultation room. Mr. Montgomery was found unconscious in the parking lot of the Thoroughbred Club around 2 this morning. He's in stable condition, but when he regained consciousness, he became agitated and kept repeating your name. My name? Why would he? He claims you attacked him, the detective stated flatly. Says you were waiting for him outside the club and hit him with something heavy. Riley stared in disbelief. That's absurd. I was at the equine sanctuary all night. Dozens of people can verify that. The detective nodded. We're aware. The timing makes his accusation impossible, which is precisely why I wanted to speak with you. This appears to be an attempt to discredit you, and I need to understand why. Professor Thompson stepped forward. Detective, are you familiar with the investigation into Catherine Jenkins's death, the one Sarah Collins has been reporting on? I've been briefed, he confirmed. The break-in at the Herald is connected to this, isn't it? We believe so, Eleanor said. My granddaughter has been receiving threatening messages since the investigation reopened. After providing statements and contact information, they left the hospital with the detective's assurance that Blake's false accusation would be documented as potential witness intimidation. Back at the sanctuary, they found Shadow significantly calmer, though still watchful. Riley approached him slowly, placing her hand on his neck. You were right, she whispered. There was danger. Sarah Collins arrived that afternoon, her normally composed demeanor visibly shaken. They're desperate, she said, accepting the cup of tea Eleanor offered. The legal team is reviewing everything I've gathered on Catherine's death. There's a link between the insurance investigator who ruled her death accidental and Montgomery Enterprises. He went to work for them 3 months after closing the case. Riley listened intently, stroking Shadow's forehead as he stood beside her chair. The horse had refused to leave her side since her return, as if understanding the threat now extended to her. Blake's return from Europe wasn't scheduled, Collins continued. According to my source, William Montgomery was furious about it. Apparently, Blake came back without permission after seeing the articles about Catherine's case online. He's afraid, Professor Thompson observed. People make mistakes when they're afraid. That evening, as Riley completed Shadow's daily assessment, she noticed a truck parked at the service entrance, one she didn't recognize. Campus security confirmed they hadn't authorized any deliveries. The sense of being watched prickled at her consciousness. We need to move, Shadow, she decided suddenly. Tonight. Professor Thompson agreed immediately. I've been thinking the same thing, but where? The Montgomery influence extends throughout the county. I know a place, Eleanor said quietly. Catherine's old training facility in Woodford County. It's been abandoned for years, but the structure is sound. I've maintained the property taxes through a trust. Under cover of darkness, they loaded Shadow into the university's oldest trailer, less conspicuous than their newer models. With Professor Thompson driving and Riley inside with Shadow to keep him calm, they traveled the back roads to the overgrown property Eleanor had described. The old training barn stood like a ghost in the moonlight, its weathered boards silver gray against the night sky. Inside, the stalls were dusty but structurally intact. Riley settled Shadow in the largest one, laying out fresh bedding they'd brought. "My mother worked here," she said wonderingly, looking around at the faded ribbons still pinned to a corkboard, the tarnished nameplates on some of the stalls. This was where she documented the first cases of abuse, Eleanor confirmed, before the Montgomerys bought out the neighboring properties and began consolidating their operation. For 3 days, they maintained a rotation so Shadow was never alone, with trusted students from the program helping maintain security. Riley spent most nights in the stall beside him, wrapped in blankets against the chill, her hand occasionally reaching through the partition to touch his flank when he grew restless. On the 4th morning, Detective Michaels called. "Blake Montgomery has recanted his accusation against you," he reported. "Claims he was confused from his head injury and misidentified his attacker." "He realized we could prove I was elsewhere," Riley concluded. "Precisely. But there's more. We found evidence linking the break-in at the Herald to a security firm contracted by Montgomery Enterprises. The district attorney is getting involved now." Later that day, Sarah Collins arrived at the old barn with news that sent shockwaves through their small group. "William Montgomery suffered a major heart attack this morning. He's in intensive care, and the Montgomery holdings are in chaos. The board of directors has called an emergency meeting to determine interim leadership." "What does this mean for the investigation?" Eleanor asked. "It's accelerated everything," Collins replied. "With William incapacitated, several board members are already distancing themselves, providing information to protect their own interests. The evidence about Catherine's death, the tampering with her car's brake lines, it's being corroborated by multiple sources now." That night, as a spring storm rolled across the Kentucky hills, Riley sat with Shadow in the old training ring. Eleanor had found her mother's ancient radio in a tack room closet, and the soft strains of Patsy Cline filled the dusty air. Shadow stood quietly beside her. His earlier panic completely subsided now that they were away from the perceived threat. "We're going to be okay," Riley told him, brushing her hand along his neck. "Both of us." 1 year later, the Catherine Jenkins Center for Equine Rehabilitation and Youth Therapy celebrated its grand opening on the completely renovated property in Woodford County. The legal battles had ended with surprising swiftness after William Montgomery's death. Blake, facing criminal charges for obstruction of justice and evidence tampering, had accepted a plea deal that included substantial financial restitution to Catherine's estate. The Montgomery Foundation, now under new management as part of the settlement, had funded the transformation of the old training facility into a state-of-the-art center, combining equine rehabilitation with therapy programs for foster youth. Eleanor Jenkins stood proudly at the entrance, cutting the ceremonial ribbon with tears glistening in her eyes. "My daughter believed that understanding horses could teach us how to understand each other," she told the assembled crowd. "Today, her vision becomes reality." Inside the main barn, Riley led a group of children from the county foster care system on a tour. Shadow walked freely beside her without halter or lead rope, the embodiment of restored trust. His coat gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the windows, the scar on his flank now barely visible beneath his healthy coat. "This is Shadow," Riley introduced him to the wide-eyed children. "He survived a fire and people who didn't understand him. Now he helps other horses and people heal." A small 5-year-old girl with solemn eyes and tightly braided hair looked up at Riley. "Can I learn to talk to horses like him someday too?" she asked hesitantly. Riley knelt to meet her eyes, smiling gently as she answered, "Horses already know who you really are. Our job is just to learn to listen to what they've always known." Words her own mother had spoken so long ago. completing a circle that now extended into a future where neither physical nor emotional scars would define the worth of any living being.